So as we frequently told you here in Davos, one of the novel, ideas of this year has been to get 7 women to represent all co-chairs at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. And I'm sure that's made for a very interesting flavour to the discussions here that have populated the agenda at Davos. Sharan Burrow, the head of ITUC, is one of those 7 co-chairs of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. And thank you very much, Sharan, for speaking to Bloomberg Quint. First, I'd like to start by what it was like to get the 7 of you together, and how that has helped shape the WEF's agenda this year.
Well, Klaus Schwab deliberately is sending a message to the world that if women aren't included in equal numbers across the board, then the future is not going to be a sustainable one. It's certainly not going to be an equal one. And so I must say we've had a terrific set of discussions. 7 women, all from very different walks of life. But last night in the co-chairs panel, then all of the issues came together under a demand for a new social contract. The world needs to accept that the global workforce is fractured. We need to heal the current workforce. We need jobs for everybody. They must be good jobs, decent work. They must pay just wages, wages on which people can live with dignity at the floor and then be able to bargain for a fair share of productivity. But also the empowerment of women and girls, the role of science in underpinning choices around future technologies. A lot of different perspectives, the sustainable environment from the CEO of Engie and how we transform the energy sector, but our businesses as a whole. But all of these things fit together around what it is are we going to do to build a future that's inclusive, that's different, and that's sustainable and that's just.
Okay, a couple of questions emanating from that response of yours. One is, this is, the last few months we've seen the Me Too campaign dominate the headlines, across the world. We had Justin Trudeau speak about it yesterday in what he delivered, was a fairly feminist speech, if people can call it that. How do you see the world reacting to this stronger voice that women seem to have found?
Well, Me Too has allowed an exposure of a problem that's been there for decades and that we've obscured by silence. In fact, tragically, the rise of the alpha male in leadership in many countries has actually almost legitimated a wave of misogyny. So the pushback is a very good thing. And that is leading to thoughtful discussions, hopefully actions from the business community, from governments as a whole. And as you said, Justin Trudeau made 2 really good points yesterday, that the current model of globalisation has failed working people and that women and girls must be an equal part of the equation and that women's legitimate complaints must be addressed with dignity and with the rule of law.
Do you believe what has started out as a Me Too campaign has sustainability to it in being able to achieve some of the goals that you've just set out for the inclusion of women in the workforce, for a more equal workplace environment, for a workplace environment that is not domineering when it comes to women or unfair or even exploitative? Well,
we must see accountability. Like the exposure's there, it's on the agenda, but it is about, of course, equal numbers of women in CEOs' positions and on boards and as heads of international institutions, but it must go much deeper than that. For us, every indicator shows progress for women has stagnated. Women are still being paid less than men, right from the floor up. Women are overrepresented in the informal economy where there's no minimum wages, no rights, no rule of law. And in India, you have a 93% informal economy. In fact, we've just affiliated 20 million informal workers out of India. And we need to make sure their jobs are formalised. Why isn't childcare formalised in many countries around the world? Are we going to invest in those jobs where women can have decent work and make sure they're good formal jobs? And then, of course, there is violence against women. And I'm delighted to say that this year the ILO, with business and labour, will negotiate a new standard, a global standard, to eliminate violence against women and men in the workplace. So it's outcomes, accountability that we want to see across the board. OK, the beginning of a long, hard trek, I would imagine, an uphill one at that, but a beginning and a very good one at that.
there were two other things that you spoke about. One was globalization and all the conversations we've seen take place here in Davos around that. And it does seem to me that the world is narrowing. It does seem to me that whether it is about protecting local industry or protecting jobs, the constant refrain now is on what we can do for local business as opposed to how we can internationalize business. And I'm not really sure what the outcome of that has been. For my generation, globalization has been the dominating theme. And I don't know what the next 10 years will be like if every single leader comes here and talks about, how to keep jobs back home, how to keep business back home. What do you think the outcomes of that will be for the global workforce?
Well, globalisation simply went too far. It was a model that was based on corporate greed, driving profits to the shareholders, the 1%. And, of course, along the way, we have now a workforce in trouble, 40% of the economy in informal work now appearing out in our supply chains, up to 45 million workers in modern slavery, unconscionable in 2018, now appearing in supply chains. That's the global trading model. And 60% of the workforce who do have formal employment, the majority of them can be on 1-month contracts, low-paid, insecure work. 84% of people around the world tell us they can't actually live on the minimum wage. And so in that sense, we need to share prosperity. But you can't have it at either extremes. If we have an interconnected world, and we do, technology, trade, people's educational standards, whatever it takes to create the mobility that is, in fact, generating our world in our countries and externally, then you've got to have a new set of rules. Change the rules, and 85% of people agree with us. They want the rules of the economy rewritten. They know that it's not technology they're particularly anxious about. They're deeply anxious about their jobs. Jobs, jobs and jobs. And jobs and stagnant wages will blow a bubble apart that is being created here as, the goodwill feel that suddenly the economy is growing at 3.5 or a little better. This is a desperate grab for, looking optimistic when we haven't fixed the fundamentals.
So you don't buy into this is a year of strong global growth. This is a year of, low unemployment in most Western nations. In the US, it is now at 4% or below. In many other Western countries in Europe, it has come down considerably ever since we saw the global financial crisis take place. The commentary around the global economy seems to be much stronger this year than I've seen it over the last decade. But you don't seem to be as much of a believer of it.
I think that we all want the economy to grow. We all want to see jobs. And yes, the stats show that, but have a look at those jobs. A professionalism like journalism used to be a strong, professional, middle-class environment. I can now show you qualified journalists with 2 degrees that earn €15 in Europe an article and are struggling to make a day's or a week's wage. So we are breaking down the quality of work, the guarantees of income that will sustain the economy. So stagnant wages, a breakdown in job security and decent work. Where's the long term coming from if it's not just speculative, if we don't heal the fractures of a current workforce in trouble?
And you also don't seem to believe that the unemployment levels or the employment levels actually paint the accurate picture.
Well, you've got to look again at the quality of jobs. Even in the US, where they say record unemployment, you have record employment. You have people working 2 and 3 jobs just to make a wage on which they can live because the minimum wage is so low and there's no job security. You have young people in all our countries who feel like their future's being stolen from them. And in developing and emerging economies, or really very wealthy economies now in terms of the G20, like India, you have up to 93% of the economy in informal work, 60-70% in other emerging economies. And even in the developed, wealthy Western countries, you actually have 20-25%, 30-35% of people with insecure work where they don't know where their next paycheck's going to come from with any degree of certainty. It's not a recipe to heal the fractured world for today, let alone a platform to build the challenges of Industry 4.0, the energy transition that's an imperative from climate change. We need to negotiate new global solutions for work, for decent work, for a secure future and for just wages.
Okay, I think that brings me to the question of what role technology is playing in all of this, because I think that too is a big risk to jobs across the world. But before that, have you had a chance to study the impact of demonetization? This was a unique exercise we carried out in India 2 years ago, where the government decided to invalidate a series of currency notes, and that seemed to have had a fairly crippling impact on the informal sector in India. Have you all had a chance to look at what the outcomes of that have been?
We haven't done any specific studies, but we do understand that the more you try and look at currency as a moderating effect globally in your own interests as a nation, the more impact it may very well have on the poorest of workers. So I think the Indian example is not on its own. We have to, though, look at what the solution is to that. Is it the challenge of demonetisation, or is it, in fact, that we're simply not formalising work and paying decent wages? If we paid a minimum living wage to every person, it's affordable. In Asia, in the supply chains of Asia, it would take less than $50 a month increase in the poorer countries or in poorer groups of people to provide a wage on which you could live with dignity. It would boost consumption, drive demand, and yet when companies are making up to $17,000 profit from every one of their supply chain workers, including those in the informal economy or the hidden supply chain workers who CEOs take no responsibility for, think of what the impact of that would be, and then those questions wouldn't be so hard.
Is technology playing a distortive impact on all of this? Because it does seem that the richest companies of the day are technology companies, and some of the outcomes of the way they do business they lie in the problems that you've just diagnosed.
Well, you have to think about the layers. Again, people tell us they're not particularly anxious about technology, but they're deeply anxious about jobs for themselves and for their children. So that's at the level of every company becoming a technology company, which is fundamentally going to be true in the interconnected world. Of course, we have 50% of people who aren't even connected to the internet, so that gives you the inequality gap. So there are opportunities. But when you look at monopoly companies now, oligopsonies if you like Amazon, and you say this model is more of the speculative destruction that actually brought us to the brink of the global economy. Because from my understanding, Amazon's not making a cent yet for its shareholders, but it's growing so large with mergers and acquisition as it tries to control the buying patterns of people right across the spectrum and indeed around the world, that people are gambling on it paying back one day. But what they're not thinking about is what is the impact of such large companies with huge speculative bubbles actually, buying up, merging with many companies that in and of themselves are actually not inclusive of local businesses. It is going to have a terribly distortionary effect, a risk on the global economy, and the ethical questions about data and control of people's data, these things aren't even being addressed seriously yet.
Now, final question then, Sharan. This is the classic conflict between labour and capital, isn't it? Very few people in the world control the capital, a very large number of people represent the labour, and it does seem that we have not been able to strike the right balance, despite years of development, in being able to offer a fair deal to both. Won't capital always dominate?
So capital and labour are codependent. You need jobs created by private sector, just as you need jobs created by the public sector, who depend on income from tax, where tax evasion is eliminated to provide care services, essential public services, social protection. But we need a new set of rules. And the G20 last year, including the Indian government, made this commitment. They said that you can no longer have violations of labour rights as part of the competition. That means we need to set a new competitive floor where the rights of people, human and labour rights, where minimum wages on which people can live with dignity, evidence-based, where you can bargain for a fair share of the productivity. These are the rules we know about, and of course they must be underpinned by universal social protection. Then capital can compete with each other, and we'd be happy to actually be part of such an economy.
Sharan, more power to your fight. Thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint, and thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.